Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. One of the most impressive people I've ever met in my life is unstoppable Tracy Schmidt. She is unbelievable. She was born as a four-limb
amputee.
She doesn't have any arms or any legs. She's got an incredible vibrancy and spirit. She's overcome almost every obstacle, and she's now launching a podcast. And so I thought it would be great to have her back on my show and find out what's going on. Tracy, unstoppable Tracy, how are you?
I am feeling unstoppable next to the phenomenal Brian Crombie, giving me some good, vibrant energy in this unusual year-end time. It's wonderful to be on your show. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, thank you so much for coming here. So tell us, you've launched this podcast. What's the podcast all about?
It's called Unstop the Story. And I mean, I feel like I almost took the name right out from you, Brian, because you are a magical soul that unstops stories for so many in the community. You're so extraordinary. And I think one of the reasons you and I clicked is because we do have this mindset where, we have stories we tell ourselves, right, in our head as individuals, right? And I get it as a four-way amputee, no, you're not going to dance or scuba dive or sail or, play with the big wigs. And then you reframe. And what's really funny is that organizations, they've got that too, right? You are unstopping the story for Ottawa senators in times of COVID, right? And you've been unstopping the story for the arts and for so many fabulous souls. You're a huge advocate out there. And that's my piece too, is to unstop the stories for individuals and for organizations.
So these are podcasts with different guests that have overcome challenges?
Yes. And in extraordinary ways. Like one of them is Frank, who is the Make-A-Wish Foundation founder. We all know this Make-A-Wish Foundation. It's international now, but he's an extraordinary man. He at like 6 years old, he was kidnapped and he was taken away and he was raised in a tent. And then at 12 years old, the person, his kidnappers, decided that they didn't want him anymore and that he was all grown up and that he had to raise himself. So at 12, he's, the only home he's known is a tent, and then they left. And so the property was in Texas, and some First Nations person, an indigenous person, raised him and kind of connected him to the community. And he grew up to be a police officer, and then he almost died on the highway. And because he was on sick leave, they sent him to this little boy that was terminal. And his dying wish was to meet Chip, because it was way back in the days when, what was that show? Chip and somebody.
Chip and Dale.
Chip and Dale? No.
Yep, Chip and Dale.
It was Chip and Dale?
Yep,
that makes me think of the inappropriate dancers. So the Chip and Dale motorcycle cops. And so he, on sick leave, on adjusted duties, and he went out and he granted this wish for this little boy because he had this philosophy, right? He had nowhere to live. So he helped an older woman take care of her lawn and paint her porch and mend her broken window. And so she hosted him in her home, right? But she wasn't his mom and she wasn't an aunt. He was just an abandoned boy at 12.
Unbelievable story.
Yeah. And that's just
so
one
if
of 10
people are
stories.
interested in only one of 10, and if people are interested in these podcasts, how do they get them?
They can search Unstop the Story on their favorite platform, iTunes, Spotify, or they can visit Unstoppable Tracy. And it's on my website. It's on all my social media. And they can check out Unstop the Story and have their souls filled and their leadership growth and make a difference in this funny, wonky time.
Unstoppable Tracy Schmidt. Thank you for that little story about, my God, guy kidnapped at such a young age and grew up to launch the Make-A-Wish Foundation. What an incredible story. We're going to take a break and come back more with Unstoppable Tracy and hear her own unstoppable story in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting with one of my most favorite people in the world, one of the most inspirational people in the world, Tracy Schmidt, unstoppable Tracy Schmidt. Tracy, you've just told us a little bit about your podcast, but before we go and hear about some of your other guests, maybe we could tell people, because maybe not everyone that's listening to us has heard your story. So you were born with no arms and no legs. Is that correct?
It is true. And I was born at a time where there weren't ultrasounds. So they didn't know that I was going to be born without my arms and my legs. And it's a funny expression, amputee, because I wasn't amputated, right? I was born this way, congenital amputee. And doctors told my parents, because they didn't know with the ultrasounds, to give me up. And anybody where I went to have artificial legs made or prosthetic devices adapted, all of the other children, they were always foster kids. I don't know anybody that's my age that were raised by their birth parents. So I'm extraordinarily lucky to have been kept by my parents, because they were advised by people you think would know that I would never sit up and never walk. And here I am sailing against World Cup sailors with no other people with disabilities, right?
So your story really is unbelievable. So you told me that as a teenager you were taking sailing lessons, and that you progressed through that to be quite the sailor. Tell us about that.
Well, and my first year I failed. And so, a lot of your listeners might be struggling right now and failing at whatever way they're reinventing. And I fell out of the boat because I was top heavy, right? No hands, no legs. And whenever there was wave or wind, and I would fall out. And it turns out you cannot pass sailing. You can't get your white sail level 1 if you cannot stay in the boat. I knew the parts of the boat and I knew the points of sail, but you got to be able to stay in the boat. But of course, that taught me to read the wind, right? If I had to predict the wind, what's coming, so that I could brace myself and either harness it or sail away and around it. And so it really taught me to be an extraordinary sailor really quick, or fall out of the boat. And I got to grow up to be this World Cup sailor. And in 2015 of December, I was at a qualifier for the Olympics, and not the Paralympic, but the Olympics. And there were 27 able-bodied men and 3 women. I was one of the 3, and everybody had their hands and their legs, and they boycotted me.
They boycotted you. Why did they boycott you?
They boycotted me. They said, so because it was in Australia, I couldn't bring my boat, too expensive to ship it there. So I had put some duct tape and a pool noodle to wedge my legs on the seat, and the duct tape to help remember I'm missing my hands. And so I've chartered an able-bodied regular boat. And they said that my boat was not one class design. And putting myself in their shoes, they have sacrificed relationships and jobs and income, and they've lived 24/7 to get to the Olympics. And so as much as they might want to be kind-hearted to somebody with no arms and no legs, this was their Olympic qualifier that they had probably sacrificed 12 years or more of their life to be in. So they don't want me cluttering up their start line. But myself, I was so focused on, of course I'm on that start line, that I didn't hear what they were saying to me. I didn't hear that they didn't want me there. I heard my boat wasn't one class design. So I ripped off the pool noodle and I ripped off the duct tape, and I said, okay. And I just showed up at the start line with no duct tape and no pool noodle, sailing the boat exactly like they were. And even if I came last, I would have been 30th out of 30 in the whole wide world. But I wasn't. I was 7th out of 30 in the whole wide world of predominantly big, strong, muscular men like yourself, Brian Crombie.
How do you compete in a Olympic, not a Paralympic, but an Olympic qualifier without the pool noodle and whatever else that you tried to have, and come in 7th? How'd you come in 7th?
Well, I was very lucky that it was light winds. So the truth behind it is it was very light winds. So the lighter you are, the more advantage you have. And most of these sailors, they sail like New Zealand, Australia, all the waters out that way, the Norwegians, they all sail like they won't even bother going out unless the wind is 20 knots. Whereas here in Toronto, if it's 20, 22 knots, the regatta cancels, right? And we don't even go out. Not just myself, but a lot of sailors don't go out at that on those knots. So they were used to sailing 20 knots and it was light winds. So I could really strategize with a light and there's 12 races. So they weren't all 12 light winds, but I did get a nice finish or two in with my points. And then the other piece is, I don't know if this is true in business. That's your savviness. But I find my little experience with business is if you start right, that's a big jump on your business, right? Well, it's the same in racing. If you kick butt on that start line, then that's like 9/10 of the game.
Really? And how do you kick butt on the start line?
And so that you got to be in position, right? You got to be going full speed on the start. So a lot of people, they hover around and they sit in irons. They sit still really near the start line. And I know if I do that, they've got your big, long, muscular arms. You go like 1 pull, 2 pull, and your mainsail's in and you're ready to sail. But I can't do that because my little hands, I got to squirrel it. So by the time I catch up to your 2 strokes, I'm at the back of the fleet. So I have to be going full speed on my start. So most of my races, my goal was just to do good on the start line. And so I practiced the start line going full speed. So I know my 5-minute countdown backwards. So when they're going 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and the gun goes off, they use a gun in the start lines for sailing. I am full speed. Whereas they're all still doing their 1-2 pull, which they can do faster than I can, but I'm already going full speed.
So you're starting obviously well back of the start line.
Well back, and I got to time it well. So that wins for me. Sometimes I blow my starts and sometimes I ace them because I am like, boom, full speed on that start line. And so I have to outthink everybody. And everybody's sailing for sometimes closest to the boat. You find out which is the favored end. You know, if the wind shifts, one end of the line is closer to the top mark than the other. But my strategy is to have clean air. I stay away from the fighting. So while they duke it out and battle out for the best spot on the start line, I pick the open spot. And open means wind. And I head for, you're the first person to ask me this. I've been having these interviews for 3 years and I'm like, I got to talk sailing which is so fun. So my strategy is to go where it's open and go at full speed and do lots. I'm out on the water like half an hour before everybody else, testing the wind and what's the fastest side of the course. So when I'm sailing up to the top mark, I already know, the right side of the course is favored or the left side of the course is favored. So I have to do a lot of strategy. Whereas they're just great sailors and they're strong and they're smart and they just go out there. Whereas I prep. And so
there is a lot of good analogy to business about preparation and homework and going where there's less competition for what you want and getting a good start, getting a good launch. All good analogies. Thank you.
Oh, and thank you for giving the parallels.
So you've also climbed the Himalayas.
Yes. I recently
tell us about that.
I just saw an article. You asked for Himalayas, and I'm thinking of scuba diving because this article just came out saying the first 4-way amputee to scuba dive, and it had me flashback to the Himalayas because when I climbed the Himalayas and when I went scuba diving, I wasn't thinking that I was the first 4-way amputee, male or female, above knees, both of my legs and above my knees, to climb the Himalayas. And it wasn't something that I communicated or celebrated, the first, right? And now all these people are coming out and they're saying they're the first. Well, they're the first to communicate it, but I was the first. I was long before they were climbing the Himalayas, and they certainly aren't 4-way amputees. And they're not female. So I did that in 91, a long time ago.
You climbed the Himalayas in 91.
I did a long time
How,
ago. I was a young teen, and I went to go when Iraq and Iran were having some pretty big uh, shutdowns of the world, and we weren't allowed to fly there in 1990. So I went back in 1991, determined to go. I didn't let it stop me, and we went. And we tried with my legs on, and that wasn't a go. And all these able-bodied people were sure that wearing my prosthetic legs would be the best way to do it. But so we went back to Kathmandu, and we left my legs in Kathmandu, and I rode back, and I did the climbing and the trekking on my knees, on my stumps. We covered my stumps with some leather booties, and I did the Himalayas on my knees, and it was much better.
Tell us why. Your stride must have been far smaller.
Yes. See, you are the smart man that you are. I had to leave much earlier in the morning, and I was the last one at camp every day.
So what was the benefit of that? That it was easier to actually walk?
Oh, I'm more stable. It was easier to walk, and I could climb. And sometimes, like, I'm using all fours, climbing and descending. And my
Tracy.
Stability was stronger, closer to the ground. Yeah. And you know what, though? Because I left so early and left so late, I was almost always traveling alone with my group because they were ahead of me or behind me, depending on the time of day, most of the time ahead of me. But the Nepalese people, they believed they hadn't seen anybody like me because people with disabilities die off. And there's only so much food. So they feed like one donkey and they don't feed all the others. And that one's got all the bells and whistles. Well, they do that with the villagers. And so people with disabilities aren't fed, they die off. So seeing me all happy and pleasant, they all assumed I must be. This picture above my head is a bit of a picture I got off a farmer on the side of the mountain. I spent my $250 in framing it beautifully here in Canada, but the picture is actually just something off a farmer off the side of the mountain. And they felt like I was on my last life because how can I be this happy and be this disabled in their books? But I got to interact with all these people, and it was amazing.
Tracy, you have competed in sailing. You've climbed the Himalayas. You've been a scuba diver. You've rappelled off of a building. You've traveled the world doing inspirational speeches. Where does this come from?
Well, I think I was very lucky to be born with a disability, right? Because you're 2 years old and you want that cookie and you're not thinking, oh, I'm disabled, I can't get it. You're like every other 2-year-old, you just want to get it. So I learned really early to do whatever it takes. I also had an extraordinarily tough love mother, right? She was from Liverpool, England. And it was pretty war-torn. And after the war, the unions were so strong that they drove all the businesses out of business. And so there wasn't much employment. And so, I was the only kid that ended up going to school who knew how to tie their shoelaces at 5 years old. None of the other kids were ready for that, right? My mom had me and my younger sister tying shoelaces and making our bed at 4 or 5 years old, right? She's a tough love mom. And if anybody ever bullied me and I came home in tears, she didn't say, oh, dear, I'm sorry. She said, how's that working for you? Right? She was a tough love mom.
So tough love, yeah. and not giving up. What are some of the other sort of lessons?
I think a lot of us hear no, N-O, as in there's no way or it's done. Right? Like a salesman with a house. Nope, they don't want to sell their house right now. Whereas like people always tell me no. They told me no sailing, skiing, scuba diving. They told me no with Air Canada on strike. They told me no, Uber can't break into Canada, right? They told me no, I can't sail in the World Cup regatta after spending my entire savings to get myself on a plane. I spent like $15,000 to get to Australia to be in that competition. And then they're trying to tell me that I'm not supposed to be there. I'm used to people very kindly and sweetly saying, no, I'm sorry. You can't go to this school or do this sport or work here. So my whole life has been finding out how come they say no. And that's how you do it. You say, oh, how come? Right? Friendly, eye contact, not why, because why is defensive. You say, how come? And then when you hear what their reasons are, you can give solutions. So when they said, no, I can't go to this school, and mom said, how come? They said, well, she's got to be able to tie her shoelaces. But my mom didn't say she can tie her shoelaces. When she said, how come? She heard him say, the principal say, essentially the secret was he was worried about being stuck with me, right? And so when my mom counteroffered, she said, can we just try? And if it doesn't work out, no problem. So she didn't counteroffer, I can tie my shoelaces. She counteroffered, if it doesn't work out, no problem. So I think another really big secret is turning that no, N-O, into K-N-O-W. What don't I know? What don't they know? How can you turn that conversation around?
And giving it a try. It sounds like on numerous occasions you just gave it a try and it worked out in the end. And I really like this comment about you didn't know you had a disability. And so therefore, too many people give up before they even try because they assume they can't do it because they've got, and whether it's a disability or a lack of education or a lack of experience or they're the wrong something or other. They just give up. They don't try. And you just didn't know not to not try. And so you did try.
And then that's in my DNA, right? I did learn, right? I didn't think I would be asked to dance at the high school dance, right? But you at least I'd had all those years before that when you try anyways, there's always some kind of journey. Like my journey was to get to the Paralympics in Rio 2016, and I didn't. But my journey, I ended up meeting Magnus Lidgedal, a gold Olympian, who's a lot like Shrek, right? He's this big powerhouse that could do a big difference like Shrek, but he doesn't have that personality to be, the leader of the village. But here's Donkey, and I hate to admit it, but I'm the donkey. I'm the cheerful, positive one connecting Shrek to the village. And so I connected Magnus Lidgedal, and Magnus and I touched every boat in the Olympics and the Paralympics for London 2012 and Rio 2016. So I didn't get to be on that start line. I got to be in 135 national, North American, international races before Rio. Like, I'm not saying I did poorly at all, but I didn't get to Rio 2016. And I think that worked out because people that went were sick from the water, and our boats were about as big as their large pigs, and there was all sorts of floating dead pigs in the water. It was a horrible experience. So I probably was in the right place to not go that particular, and I got to support making a difference for many more people, better than just me, better to get everybody from every country supported in the Paralympics and the Olympics.
Unstoppable, Tracy Schmidt. Thank you so much for that little history of your story. We're going to take a break and come back, and we're going to ask Tracy to tell us a little bit more about her podcast and some of her guests and the stories that she's going to be relating through the podcast. Stay with us just for a minute. Welcome back to the unstoppable Tracy Schmidt on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. Tracy, we've just talked about your own story, or just a part of your own story, but you've now launched this inspirational podcast talking about other people's stories. And you told us about Frank, I think his name was Frank, who started the Make-A-Wish Foundation. Who else have you had? You said you've had several different people on your podcast. Tell us, if you could, about some of the other podcasts.
Yes. So here in Ontario, many of your listeners are Canadian. I have Kevin Frankish, the breakfast television host from way back when, and he's the man with suspenders that you might remember. and he's all about wellness. And he himself had an anxiety attack on air. And, you know, you saw him propose on air and raise his children on air. And he has a really loyal following. And he also has a podcast called The Happy Molecule. And it's about
Happy Molecule.
The Happy Molecule. Because, you know, we can release those when someone gives us a finger on the highway and cuts us off, our sympathetic nervous system revs us up. Right? Well, you can do the same thing. Just like you can easily engage your sympathetic nervous system, you can engage your parasympathetic nervous system. And so he's
okay. Hold it. What's the sympathetic? What's the parasympathetic nervous system?
Really? So our autonomic nervous system, like in our spine, and I like to call autonomic nervous system is like our automatic nervous system. And so it's nerves through our spines. It communicates to our brains. Right. And there's endorphins and molecules that communicate messages to us. It's like we see something and it scares us. Like the first time you see a dog. Well, if you make that think it's bad, well, then your next thought pattern is going to be bad because you were scared. And then what you do is forevermore believe it's bad. And then you just skip the thinking. Then you just go with the memory of feeling scared. Right? That's part of unstopping the story. We get the story in our brain and it's rooted in something real. Somebody said, oh, girls can't do that, or you're a redhead, or you're not smart enough, or you don't have an MBA, or, you know, you went bankrupt, or, you know, you have an accent, whatever the story is. And you've somehow got a feeling in your gut, and that automatically releases some juices, your sympathetic nervous system, and your brain makes it mean something. And it may or may not be accurate. It's just what you interpreted when you felt it. So you have this feeling and you turn it into thinking. And that's when the danger starts. We have this story that we continuously believe.
Okay, so that's Kevin. Tell us about someone else.
Oh, so Kevin has depression, and he's really great about turning it around. And Peter Thurin from Australia. So I have somebody famous kind of from all over the place. Peter Thurin's from Australia, and his story is easy to do, easy not to do. And all of the stories start with a bit of my story, right? There's 10 chapters in my book, and I share 10 stories of mine, and then I pivot that to our guest, right? So I share a bit about change, and my story and my insights and my lesson about change. And then I invite Peter on, easy to do, easy not to do, this famous Australian. He's global speaker, and he talks about easy to do, easy not to do. He spent 36 years wanting to do karate, and then one day he decided he was going to do it. And it was easy to not do it for 36 years. And it was easy to do it that one day when he decided to pick up the phone and register. Well, this was an epiphany for him, and that influenced him. And he's a pharmacist by business and all sorts of other businesses out there. He's quite famous as an Australian speaker, Peter Thurin. And Dr. Alan Bernard, he's a South African, and he is world renowned in theory of constraints. And so how do we
theory of constraints?
Theory of constraints. So for example, a constraint might be decision fatigue, right? Sometimes we make so many decisions in a day that we end up choosing, instead of making a bad decision, we choose no decision, for example. And so he's a behavior scientist. And it's all about making better, faster decisions based on his research. So he's worked for Microsoft and made them a 5% increase in profits. He shares a story on my podcast about this coal mine company, all these resistant, angry people. And Alan is like 6'5", and this big blonde South African perfect looking human being. He's a blonde version of you, my friend Brian. He looks a lot like you, but 6'5" and blonde. And yes, there you go. So he has this gorgeous South African accent, and he tells this story of how he went into this coal mine, and he's kind of a pretty boy, right? And there's all these coal miners that are rough and gruff, and they're losing millions of dollars. And he goes in there to consult with them, and they're all looking at him like, what does he know about our business? And he's right? And he doesn't know anything. So he's facing this coal miner, and he's like, so what would you need? And he's like, well, we got all this coal. We could sell what you need with the demand, but we need to buy machines to actually, I'm using the wrong words, but harvest the coal, for example, mine the coal. But of course, we're not making any money, so we can't afford to buy the machines. So he says, and they said, it's absolutely impossible. And so Dr. Alan Bernard, he's looking at them and he says, yeah, sounds impossible. And then he does a big silent pause and he says, unless. Impossible unless. And the rough and gruff coal miner guy says, okay, I'll play your silly game. Impossible unless we buy this equipment. And so he says this about these big cranes. And he says, okay, what's the cost of the equipment? And they write it on the board. And he's like, okay, and what's the profits you'll make if you harvest this coal? Well, of course, it was 10 times the amount of the cost of the machines. So the people that were telling them, no, they can't have these machines, are now ready and prepared to buy these machines because they've demonstrated the business relationship. Now, of course, Dr. Alan Bernard tells the story much more eloquently, and he tells more stories. He talks about decision fatigue, and he talks about why really smart
What's decision fatigue?
Decision fatigue. Like, he shared an interesting analogy about, how why women and men, like men get up, you get dressed in your suit and out the door. And they say maybe one of the reasons women have decision fatigue in their research, he doesn't mean to be condescending, but we've got to decide what to wear, our makeup, our hair, we take care of the kids, we take care of the food, and there's all the getting ready that by the time we walk out the door, we've made well over 100 more decisions than a man has made before he's walked out the door. So we're already well into decision fatigue when we hit the workplace, for example. And so it's you need to make lots of decisions. It's funny that people at high up levels that delegate out. Like, I know you're the CFO, but I know that you get delegated to by your boss to handle some of those problems and those troubles. So his brain is left to make the powerful decisions and strategies because you're busy meddling in the exhausting decisions to make it work. And then
so what's the answer? The answer is don't make too many decisions and save your time and decision-making power for the important ones.
He says, I'd rather be a tease and say, well, you've got to listen to the podcast, but I'll answer for you and say it's better from the scientist. Remember, it's better from the scientist. But Dr. Alan Bernard says, our scarcest resource is not time and money, for example. Our scarcest resource is how we spend our time. And so, for example, some of us are our prime selves from, say, 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. or 7 a.m. to 9 a.m., right? Like your best productive time, and that you find yourself sucked into, say, Facebook or commenting or looking for interviewers for your fabulous radio show. But is that making the Brian Crombies and the Unstoppable Tracys, big mortgage because we both invested in these beautiful places to live before COVID and had our worlds upside down and we were doing all right. So we were okay to live in these nice homes. And now COVID's hit and maybe our income streams are a little bit different. And so I do spend probably my most awake. I get on, I look at Facebook, and then boom, I'm appreciating and loving and being grateful for and sending thank you emails. And then I'm not sending, 100 emails a day to my past clients to say, hey, December 3rd's come up, International Day of People with Disabilities. Would you like to bring me in for your team?
So the most important, most productive time of your day, you've got to save for the most important decisions.
Yes. It sounds simple, but we don't do it.
Yep. No, I spoke with someone who who wrote a book in 2 months, and I was so impressed. And what she did is she said, "I know I'm most productive between 6 and 8 a.m." And so what I did is just got up at 5:45, sat down at my desk, and wrote a chapter. Not every day, but maybe every half day, or in 2 or 3 days she wrote a chapter, and she got it done in 2-3 months, and it was incredible. And then she went on to everything else that she had to do.
Yes. So focus and don't let the phone and the world filter in.
Have you got one more for us?
Another story?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I have Jerry Roberts and Kathy Smart. So Kathy Smart, since you brought up sailing, so when I was 8 years old falling out of that boat, remember, it's all other able-bodied kids in that boat. So I'm no arms, no legs. I got red pigtails. I got glasses. I think I had braces. Right? I was everything under the sun, and I was falling out of the boat where ferries are crossing between Toronto Harbor and Center Island, was sort of a dangerous inner harbor, and I'm falling out of the boat. And Kathy Smart was the woman that kind of allowed me to come back and sail and believed in me at 18 years old. And Kathy Smart was with me when I climbed the Himalayas. Kathy Smart was with me on my second tall ship in the North Sea. So Kathy is exactly 10 years older than me. And she's I've kind of shadowed her my whole life. And she doesn't like to stick around. She started the very first sailing school for people with disabilities, for children with disabilities in the 80s in all of Canada. And right now she's in Bhutan, supporting Bhutan with a trail so that people can trek the Bhutan region of the Himalayas. And in 2022 has an initiative to make pieces of it accessible. Of course, you can't do the whole thing because it's full of stairs, but pieces of it so that it's accessible for folks. So she's this breakthrough artist, and she comes in like somebody with a red cape, and she's the bull, and you flave the red flag of, oh, there's no sailing. Oh, there's no Bhutan Trail. Oh, there's a tall ship in the Eastern Atlantic. She is a tough nut. She is a tough nut. And not everybody loves her right away because she's a powerhouse, but she makes inroads, and she has the biggest heart. She cries when she hears the bagpipes, but people think she's so tough. And she is tough. She breaks inroads, and she doesn't take no for an answer. And she is one of my guests. And she talks about knowing me at 8 years old. And she talks about the Bhutan Trail that she's making inroads with now today.
Fantastic. Sounds like some great stories. Remind us how we find these podcasts.
Unstoppable Tracy. There's a podcast link on my website. Every social media page is talking about Unstop the Story, or you type Unstoppable Tracy or Unstop the Story on your favorite iTunes, Spotify, Google, whatever your favorite player is, and you'll find Unstop the Story with Unstoppable Tracy with these fabulous guests.
So I met Unstoppable Tracy Schmidt first when she was doing a speech at a TED Talk, and was bowled over at how inspirational she was and how dynamic she was and how moving her speech was. And it really did inspire everyone in the audience. But then, interesting enough, a whole bunch of us went out for drinks in a bar afterwards, and the bar had a stairway up, and we needed to navigate that, and then there weren't the right seats. And you know what? It was, in addition to the inspiring speech, the way that she handled absolutely every single obstacle that came in her way with the most pleasant and determined manner I've ever met in anyone in my whole entire life. And so, Tracy Schmidt, I got to tell you, your stories are inspirational, and I'm convinced that your podcasts are going to be inspirational. I'm going to have to check them out. We're going to take a break and come back more with some concluding comments with Unstoppable Tracy Schmidt in just a minute. Stay with us. Well, what a fascinating evening chatting with Tracy Schmidt, Unstoppable Tracy Schmidt, who was born with no arms and no legs, a 4-limb amputee. and never gave up, and never realized that she was disabled or should give up. And she just went for everything her whole life. She's been a World Cup sailor. She's climbed the Himalayas. She's rappelled down sides of buildings. She's been a scuba diver. And I got to tell one story. I was honored to be invited to a gala with Tracy at one point in time. It was, I think, March of Dimes gala, was it not? And you were the star of the evening, which was really quite fun, in a beautiful dress. And I was in a black tie, and everyone was treating you incredibly well. And then afterwards, what they did is they closed down the dinner and invited everyone next door to the dance floor. And so we got up and said hello to a bunch of different people and wandered over to the dance floor. And I didn't know what to do. I wasn't sure what to do. And so I said, can you dance? And you said, I'd love to dance. and we got up on the dance floor, and I like to twirl when I dance. And so we started just dancing. And then I asked if you could twirl, and you said, of course I can twirl. And we had a crowd of people staring at us, watching us dance. And you were the most beautiful dancer. And I was a little worried you were going to trip over something and things like that. So I was, but you know what? You were a beautiful dancer. And I can't imagine how in your 2 prosthetic legs you could dance. Aww. But you did it. And you know what? You can dance with me. You can climb the Himalayas. You can scuba dive. You can sail with able-bodied men. You're amazing, Tracy Schmidt. You're unstoppable.
Oh, well, I wasn't on that dance floor alone. I had a phenomenal dancing lead, and that's been my entire life. And all your listeners are unstoppable too. And those lifelines, when I climb the Himalayas, there's someone on my belay line. There's someone on my safety line. And so thank you to all your listeners for listening in. And
so Tracy, lots of people are finding this era challenging.
Yes.
They're stuck at home. They've lost jobs. They've lost businesses. They're challenged in so many different ways. The revenue is down. Their employment income is down. Mm-hmm. What do you say to them? Based on your experience, what do you say to them?
I can't begin to imagine what's going on in everybody's world, right? Some people are all the things you've mentioned and more. Broken relationships and illness with loved ones and family. Just horrible losses of all sorts of unmentionable kinds. I think the abuse hotline's up like 600%. I do not know what's going on with your listeners right now, but I do know that when I live a life of no excuses, I get to live a life of no limits. So a bit of tough love from my mother passed on to you. You have some very real reasons to be down and stopped. But let's unstop the story. No excuses, no limits. And we can be unstoppable and limitless right along with Brian Crombie and Unstoppable Tracy.
Well, thank you for that. No excuses, no limits pitch. Something that we all need to hear. Remind us again, your website and how we find the podcasts.
Unstoppable Tracy. So unstoppable. There's 2 P's. And I like to joke, no hands, no legs, no extra parts on my body, and no extra letters in my name. There's no E in Tracy. UnstoppableTracy.com. And you'll find my podcast or Unstop the Story on your favorite platform.
Well, I highly recommend everyone check out Unstoppable Tracy with no E in Tracy, and Unstop. What was it? Unstop the Story, the podcast platform. Because if I can tell you, there's anyone that's inspired me in my life, it's been Unstoppable Tracy. So I'm sure that her story and these podcast stories will inspire you as well. Well, that's our show for tonight. You can find me every Monday through Friday at 9:60 on your AM dial at 6 p.m., or you can stream me online at saga960am.ca, or you can find all of my video casts and podcasts either on Facebook the next day or on my website anytime at briancrombie.com. Good evening, everyone. Have a great time. And remember, no excuses, no limits. Thanks, Tracy.
Thanks, Brian.